Kids may be dismissed to kids worship at this time. And so last week we started this sermon series, Finding Calm in a Chaotic World. Our series text is Philippians 4, 6, and 7. And it says there, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." So, as we started this series, we talked about the mess our world is in. We all realize the world is crazy, and there's a lot of chaos around us. I think one of the best ways to describe it is what I witnessed a couple of weeks ago, when you take a bunch of 3-year-olds, put them on a soccer field, and you give them no rules, no instructions, and no organization, and let them play soccer. It's anything but soccer. It's everywhere. They're on the wrong field. They're kicking the ball in the wrong goal. It's crazy. It's chaos. And that's the way our world is that we live in today. But our text for the series says, "Be anxious for nothing." Be anxious for nothing. So how do we do that? Well, in Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 8, there are 4 admonitions that we need to follow. Last week was from verse 4. "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice." And so the first admonition is celebrate. Celebrate the Lord's sovereignty. Celebrate the Lord's grace. Celebrate always. Always. Because there's always something with God that we should be celebrating. And so celebrate always. Get your focus right. Get your focus off of yourself and off of the mess you find yourself in, and put that focus on God. And you will find a reason to celebrate always. Okay, so today we come to the letter A in the word calm. And we want to think, what does this A represent? And so let's think about the admonition. In verses 5 and 6 of Philippians, it says, "Let your gentle spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Let your requests be made known to God. So how do we keep our heads when everybody else is losing theirs? Well, the scripture tells us that the Lord is near. That's an important phrase. The Lord is near. There may be times that you feel like you're alone. There may be times that you feel like nobody cares. But remember, the Lord is near. The Lord is near. To Abram, in Genesis 15:1, he says, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield." To Hagar, in Genesis 21:17, he said, "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." To Isaac, in Genesis 26:24, he says, "Fear not, for I am with you and will bless you." To Joshua, in Joshua 1:9, he said, "Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." So God is near, and we don't have to be afraid. We just need to trust Him. So, do you ask the Lord for help? That's the letter A. Ask. Do you ask the Lord for help? In his book, The Dance of Hope, Bill Fry remembers the day when he was a boy trying to pull a stump out of the Georgia dirt. And when he was 11 years old, one of his chores was to find the firewood for the small stove and fireplace at their homestead. And so he would search in the wood for pine stumps, because those stumps had lots of resin and they would burn quicker and they would make good kindling. And so he was looking for those stumps, and he writes this in the book. One day I found a large stump in an open field near the house and tried to unearth it. I literally pushed and pulled and crowbarred for hours. But the root system was so deep and large, I simply couldn't pull it out of the ground. I was struggling when my father came home from his office, spotted me working, and came over to watch. I think I see your problem, he said. What's that? I asked. You're not using all of your strength, he replied. I exploded and told him how hard I had worked and for how long. No, he said, you're not using all of your strength. And when I cooled down, I asked what he meant. And he said, you haven't asked me to help. Well, are we like Bill? Are we using all of our strength? Have we asked God for help in the midst of our chaos? That's what we've got to do. He's near. He's waiting. He wants to help. But he wants us to ask. Ask. So thinking about that, thinking about prayer, why is prayer so important? Why is it so important? Well, first of all, prayer is expected. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says several different times, but we'll start with 6:5. When you pray. When you pray. He didn't say if you pray. He expected everybody to pray. So he said, when you pray. We are expected to pray. And not just the 3 times a day at mealtime. Not just at breakfast, lunch, and supper. We're expected to pray. Jesus demonstrated the importance of prayer numerous times in his life. But just to give you a few examples. In Matthew chapter 14, Jesus gets word that his cousin, John the Immerser, has been beheaded. And he just wants to go away. He wants some time by himself. He wants to be able to grieve. And he just needs that time to get away for himself. And so he gets in the boat with his disciples and they go out across the sea. The problem was so many people saw him get in the boat. And the Sea of Galilee is not that big of a sea. They could see where the boat was and what direction it was headed, and they started around the shore. And when Jesus came to a desolate place, there they were waiting. Jesus doesn't have time for himself. He immediately begins to teach. And he taught them. And after teaching them all day long, he looked at one of the disciples and said, where are we going to find food to feed this crowd? And then after teaching all day, after all of the grief and problems he's got in his own life right now he's concerned about these people having something to eat because he's taught them all day long and there's nowhere to go. McDonald's is not right around the corner. And they have to eat. And so the feeding of the 5,000 took place. But when you get to verse 23, it says that after he dismissed the crowd, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. All day long, Jesus had met the needs of others. But now, he dismissed the crowd. He sends everybody home. He sends the disciples out on the Sea of Galilee. And he goes up on the mountain all by himself to pray. He needed that after a busy day and after having his own grief issues that day. But what about when Jesus had important decisions to make? In Luke chapter 6, we come to that point where Jesus needs to finalize who his 12 disciples are going to be, or the 12 apostles, who they're going to be. And so in Luke chapter 6 and verse 12, it says, in those days he went to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. An important decision to make. And he went out in the mountain all night long to pray. Or another time, as Jesus' popularity was growing, and people far and wide were finding out about Jesus, and they were coming and they were listening to Jesus teaching, and Jesus was teaching and healing. And how does he deal with his newfound popularity? That everybody wants to come and hear Jesus and wants to be healed. And Luke 5:16 says, but he would withdraw to desolate places and pray. See, Jesus didn't let it go to his head. He went to God and prayed about all of these things. The night before he would be crucified, we know where we find Jesus. In the garden. He takes his disciples in the garden and says, you sit here while I go over there and pray. And Jesus prayed. And as he prayed, he sweat like great drops of blood because of the anguish that he was in, because he knew what he was going to face the next day. And he asked God for help. He asked God for help at the end of a long, exhausting day. He asked God for help in his grief. He asked God for help in his popularity. He asked God for help on every occasion that you can think of. Now, did Jesus believe in prayer? It's obvious he did. But let me ask you this. If Jesus, the Son of God, needed to pray after a long, exhausting day, needed to pray in the midst of his grief, he needed to pray when he found popularity, he needed to pray when he had important decisions to make, he needed to pray when he knew what was coming and he needed the strength to face it the next day. If he needed to pray, what about us? We need to think about those things. So many times, people in their grief or after a long, exhausting day say, where's God? Well, God is near. He's waiting on you. He's waiting on you to ask for the help that you need. And that's what's so important and what we need to remember. If we're going to find calm in our chaos, we need to pray. The New Testament's full of passages that tell us how much we need to pray. But think about two of them real quick. Romans 12:12 says, rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, and be constant in prayer. And 1 Thessalonians 5:17, everybody probably knows that one already. Pray without ceasing. We're supposed to be in an attitude of prayer all day long. You know, you don't have to necessarily bow your head and close your eyes to pray to God. You know, when you're sitting behind the steering wheel in your car, that's a good time to be praying. That God keep you safe. Because we all take a gamble every time we get in an automobile. There are lots of times we need to pray with our eyes wide open. Now, I'm not saying there's not times there's that we shouldn't pray with our eyes closed, our heads bowed, down on our knees? I mean, I saw a sign the other day I thought really fit well. It said, when you cannot stand any longer, kneel. And how important that is to think about. We need to pray, and we need to be in the attitude of prayer constantly, all day long. But there are times we just need to stop from all this chaos in the world and find a quiet place where there's nobody but me and God, or you and God, and sit down and pray. And just have a good heart-to-heart conversation with God. So, prayer is expected. But prayer should not be exhaustive. Prayer should not be exhaustive. What do I mean by that? Well, in Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells a parable that's very important. And you may want to look at that parable as we're talking about it. Luke chapter 18. And one thing that's unique about this parable is that usually Jesus doesn't tell us the point of the parable beforehand, but this one it does. This one tells us that we should always pray and not lose heart. That's the point. But let's think about that. And that's from the English Standard Version. If you're reading the King James, it says not to faint. Young's literal translation says not to faint. The contemporary English version, and I like this translation, is never give up. When you pray, and never give up. Don't faint. Don't lose heart. Don't quit. Keep praying. That's the idea that we need to understand. So let's think about the parable. Now you've heard this parable, and this is a difficult parable. And so we have to think about, we know what the point is. So let's get into the parable. Because there are two characters in this parable. One is a judge, a corrupt judge. You know, one of those kind that takes bribes under the table. One of those kinds that cares nothing about anyone except himself. And how is he going to better himself? He's the kind of judge that if they had a mafia in his day, he was probably working with them, keeping them safe while they kept him safe, and they all looked out for each other to pad his pockets. This judge didn't care what anybody had to say. Now, ideally, the judges in Hebrew times in the Old Testament were supposed to defend the poor and the widows, according to Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy 24. That was one of their responsibilities, not this judge. He didn't care about anybody. He didn't care about widows. He didn't care about the poor. He didn't care about the orphans. He just had no compassion. Didn't care about God's laws. He didn't care about public opinion. He had pity on no one. Then the second character in the parable is a widow. Now this is important to understand. She's a widow. That means that she has no one to help her in her defense. She doesn't have a husband. There's no mention of a son. There's no mention of a lawyer that's pleading her case. It's this judge and this widow. And that's it. They're just the two of them. Just the two of them. But notice her complaint, because this is what's important. Give me justice against my adversary. Give me justice against my adversary. Now, as you read the parable, the widow continuously comes to the judge. Give me justice against my adversary. Now, who is her adversary? What are the injustices that are done to her? We don't know. But what she's pleading for is, give me justice against my adversary. Give me justice against my adversary. Wherever this judge goes, he can't get away from her. I mean, wherever he is, she's there. I want justice against my adversary. I want justice against my adversary. If he were to go out in a restaurant to eat, she'd show up. I want justice against my adversary. If he was to get in his limousine, she would be right there. I want justice against my adversary. Wherever he went, whatever he did, he couldn't get rid of her. And she was constantly saying the same thing. Give me justice against my adversary. Well, the judge wasn't concerned about the woman at all. So why did he give in? Look at Luke 18, verse 5. Luke 18 and verse 5 says, Yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice, so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming. Now look at that phrase, beat me down, in the English Standard. In the King James it says weary me. In Young's literal translation it says plague me. In the contemporary English version it says wear me out. What's interesting, and it's almost humorous, the Greek word. Sometimes in English we miss the humor in the Bible. But the Greek word means beat him under the eye. Beat him under the eye. I mean, get the picture. The Greeks use this word. In sporting events, particularly boxing, they use this word, how one opponent against another, and one would beat him under the eye, or one would, this left hook, or this is the left hook, and this right jab, and on, back and forth, but one will wear the other one down in this boxing match. And what the judge sees is that he's in this boxing match with the widow, and she's going to beat him down because she never gives up. She keeps on coming, and she's going to win the boxing match. So he throws in the towel and forfeits. He throws in the towel and forfeits. Now, that's a strange parable. Of all the parables Jesus told, it's the strangest of parables, and we have to try to understand what he meant. And so when we say, well, the judge must represent God. Yes and no. I mean, the judge didn't care about anybody. That doesn't represent God. Because God cares. God is near. He wants to hear and answer our prayers. But the judge is like God because the judge had the power to grant the woman's request. And that's the only comparison between the judge and God. They both have the power to grant the request. So God has that power. He wants to hear our prayers. It's not that he wants us to pester him. No, we're not to pester him. But we should never give up as we're seeking justice. Never give up as we're seeking things that are holy and good and righteous and compassionate. And those things God wants to help us that we might represent him here on this earth. And so when you start praying, and you're praying for justice, and you're praying for righteousness, and you're praying for good, and you're praying in the will of God, don't quit. Pray. Pray every opportunity you have to pray. Be like the widow and be everywhere that unjust judge was at so that she could get her request made and the judge would grant it. Let your requests be made known to God. I mean, think, God knows. God knows what we need, but God wants us to voice it. Why does God want us to voice it? Because we are dependent on Him. And it's not until we voice it and ask for it, and not just one time, but over and over and over, continuing to ask, that we realize, hey, I am dependent on God, and I can't function in this world without His help. But when we learn to pray like that, when we learn to pray for everything that's righteous, for everything that's good, there's everything that's compassionate, everything that's just, when we learn to pray like that, we begin to realize that prayer is effective. Prayer is effective. In James 5:16, it says, the prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. And he goes on to verse 17 to explain and give us an example. And the example is Elijah. And Elijah is one of my favorite characters in the Old Testament. I mean, I just love, I wish I could have been there to see the look on Ahab's face. Because in chapter 17, we see Elijah just walks right up to Ahab, out of the clear blue, never been introduced to him before. And out of the clear blue, he looks at him and says, it's not going to rain until I say so. That's telling the king of Israel, it's not going to rain until I say so. Who has that kind of boldness? Elijah did. How did Elijah have such boldness? Because Elijah had been praying and talking to God about this whole issue. Because Ahab was a wicked king. And the prophets of Baal and Asherah had taken over in Israel. And the true God wasn't being worshipped the way that he should be. And Elijah and God had been talking about all of that. And they said, we're going to do something about it. And so Elijah said, okay, I got it, God. And God and Elijah come to an agreement on this. It's not going to rain until Israel realizes God is God. Now think about the boldness that takes. Think about the suffering that you got to be prepared for. I mean, it didn't rain for 3 years. Now, it hadn't rained for 2 months, and we know how we're suffering. You know, we all like to see a little rain, especially if you got a fall garden. You'd really love to have some rain so it will grow, right? That's just 2 months. Think about 3 years. No rain. None. You see, Elijah went down by the brook, but the brook dried up. And there wasn't any water there. So he had to go somewhere else, right? Of course, we know he went and he found another place to be. But during that time, he had to depend on God to take care of him. Right? But he didn't give in about the rain. He kept praying about that it not rain until he said so. And finally, they had that great contest on Mount Carmel. And we all know about the contest, the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah dancing around their altar, cutting themselves, waiting for fire to come down out of heaven. And no pagan god can do that. But Elijah, after he had taunted them and made fun of them all day long, he said, okay, well, y'all had your turn. It's my turn. He said, but before I take my turn, dig a trench. Pour water on this altar, on this sacrifice. Drench it. Fill up the trench with water as you pour all of that on that sacrifice. And then he just looks up into heaven and he says, God, let these people know you are God. And immediately, fire out of heaven consumed the sacrifice, the altar, and all the water in the trench. Everything's gone. Whose God is God? Where's the power of prayer? You know, we give God the credit for the great miracle. Think about Elijah's prayer. 3 years he's been praying about this. 3 years. He didn't give up. He didn't lose heart. He kept praying. And he proved whose God was really God. Jesus tells us to pray. In Matthew 7 and 8, it says, ask, and it will be given unto you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be open. See, a real Spirit-filled, prevailing prayer changes things. It changes things. It's an exercise in our faith and in our confidence to God, who's the source of all power. It's not a magic wand just to use when we're in trouble, but it is our connection to God, who is the source and supply of every need that we have. Prayer is effective. Now, if you're like me, we don't have to be convinced of the place and the power of prayer. We know those things. But we need to be reminded prayer should be a priority. We need to be reminded that we have to take time for prayer and guard that time. That means we got to remove all distractions that get in the way that keep us from praying and all the busyness, because if Satan can keep us busy, then he's won his battle. And we need to be persistent. Pray always. Do not lose heart. God is begging you to jumpstart your prayer life. And he is guaranteed that he will make things right. But we can't give up. We've got to understand he's the one that's going to be the one that supplies those needs. We just have to keep asking. Keep asking. Pray and do not lose heart. Okay, so if you're here this morning and you're outside of Christ, you certainly are in a very chaotic world. And you need to celebrate the Lord. You need to ask him for his help. But first of all, you've got to give yourself to him. If you're here this morning and you have a decision to make, I want you to come while we stand and sing, I am.